Mary's alarm rang at 5 a.m. sharp. She rolled out of her small bed in the cramped service quarters and began her daily routine. It was a crisp, clear morning at the Smith residence, a sprawling mansion in the wealthy suburb of Riverdale. She preparing breakfast in the grand kitchen that still felt foreign despite her years of service. As she wiped down the marble countertops, a cold draft caught her attention. Mary turned towards the kitchen door that led to the backyard and noticed it was ajar. Her brow furrowed. She was certain she had closed it the night before. She pushed the door shut, listening for the familiar click of the lock, and returned to her chores, unease settling in her stomach. Mary moved on to the living room where the large windows. As she drew them back, a red, dark stain on the ivory fabric caught her eye. Blood. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could have left it there, and why? She examined her hands and arms, ruling out the possibility of her own injury. The sudden creak of the staircase made her jump. She looked up to see Gary, the Smiths' 14-year-old son, descending slowly. His face was pale and dark circles framed his wide, frightened eyes. He flinched when their gazes met, quickly looking away. Mary's concern deepened. "Good morning, Gary," she greeted, trying to sound calm. "Are you all right?" Gary mumbled something incoherent and hurried past her into the dining room. Mary watched him go, her mind racing with questions. Before she could dwell further, the commanding voice of Robert Smith echoed through the hall. "Mary, the coffee better be ready. I have a crucial meeting today," Robert barked as he strode into the room, his presence imposing and cold. "Yes, Mr. Smith," Mary replied, hurrying to pour his coffee. Robert sat at the head of the table, flipping through the newspaper with a stern expression. His wife, Evelyn, appeared moments later, impeccably dressed, but with a distant, almost robotic demeanor. She barely acknowledged Mary or Gary, who was now seated quietly at the table, poking at his breakfast. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in this household. Robert and Evelyn's interactions with Gary were curt, devoid of warmth. Gary, usually quiet and reserved, seemed particularly on edge today. After serving breakfast, Mary discreetly returned to the living room. She needed to understand what was happening. The bloodstain on the curtain and Gary's terrified demeanor were troubling. Mary's instincts told her there was more beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family. Later that day, when the Smiths were out, Mary took the opportunity to search for clues. She went back to the kitchen door, checking for any signs of forced entry, but found none. Her eyes then landed on the surveillance cameras the Smiths had installed around the exterior of the house. An idea formed in her mind. She had to see for herself what was going on inside. The next morning, Mary woke even earlier, determined to gather evidence. She brought a small camera she had purchased years ago and installed it discreetly in the living room, hidden behind a decorative vase. The Smiths' behavior, Gary's fear, the bloodstain, it all pointed to something sinister. The Smith household was cloaked in an eerie quietness as the evening descended. Mary, heart-pounding, sat in her small room adjacent to the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the screen of her laptop. She had set up the hidden camera days ago, and now it was time to review the footage. She clicked through the files, her anxiety growing with each passing second. The screen flickered, showing mundane scenes of the Smiths' day-to-day life. But then, her breath caught as she saw Robert, his face contorted with rage, storm into the living room. Gary was there, trying to make himself small, his eyes wide with fear. Gary flinched, but didn't move fast enough. Robert grabbed him by the arm, yanking him roughly. Mary watched, horrified, as Robert struck Gary, the sound of the slap muffled but unmistakable. Gary's silent cry tore at her heart. The boy's frail body crumpled to the floor, but Robert wasn't done. He leaned over, yelling something Mary couldn't make out, his face inches from Gary's. Mary paused the video, her hands shaking. She knew Robert was harsh, but this was brutality. She couldn't unsee the terror in Gary's eyes or the viciousness in Robert's actions. Something had to be done. Taking a deep breath, Mary reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name. Carl. They hadn't spoken in years, but he was the only person she could think of who might help. She hit the call button, her mind racing. "Carl, it's Mary," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need your help." "Mary? Wow, it's been a while. What's going on?" Carl's voice was a comforting rumble on the other end of the line. "I don't have time to explain everything, but I'm in trouble. Or rather, a boy I know is. He's being hurt, Carl. I need your help to get him out." There was a pause. "All right, Mary. What do you need me to do?" Relief flooded through her. "Can you come over tomorrow? We need to talk in person. I'll explain everything." "I'll be there," Carl promised. "Just hang tight." Mary ended the call, her mind a whirlwind of plans and fears. She couldn't let Robert get away with this. Gary needed her, and now she had an ally. The next day, Mary moved through her chores with a heightened sense of urgency. She kept a close eye on Gary, who seemed more withdrawn than ever. Each interaction with Robert or Evelyn was charged with tension, the household's facade of normalcy growing thinner by the hour. That evening, as the Smiths sat in the dining room, Mary quietly slipped out to meet Carl. Mary sat at the corner table of the dimly lit cafe, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, matching the rhythm of her anxious heartbeat, her mind consumed with worry for Gary. The door jingled, and Carl walked in, his presence bringing a wave of relief. "Mary," he said, sitting down across from her, "tell me everything." She took a deep breath, recounting the past weeks, the bloodstain, the hidden camera, Robert's violent outbursts. Carl listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "We need to get him out of there," Mary concluded, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But it has to be done carefully. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Carl nodded. "I've got a truck. It's not much, but it'll do the job. We'll need to plan the timing. When's the best chance to get him out?" "Robert leaves early for work," Mary replied. "Evelyn usually heads out mid-morning for her social gatherings. That's our window." Carl leaned back, considering. "All right. We'll move at dawn. I'll be parked a few blocks away. You get Gary ready and bring him out as soon as the coast is clear." Mary's stomach churned with nerves, but she nodded. "I've been keeping an eye on him. He's scared, but he trusts me. We'll need some supplies, clothes, food, anything to get us through the first few days." Carl made a list on a napkin, his handwriting neat and precise. "I'll take care of it. Meet me back here tomorrow night to finalize everything." Mary left the cafe feeling a mixture of fear and determination. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on her, but she knew there was no other choice. Gary's safety was all that mattered. Back at the Smith house, Mary resumed her duties, keeping a close watch on Gary. He moved through the day like a ghost, his eyes hollow and distant. Mary's heart ached for him, but she couldn't afford to let her emotions show. She had to stay focused. The next night, Mary met Carl at the cafe again. He handed her a small duffel bag filled with essentials. "This should cover the basics," he said. "We'll get more once we're safe." Mary nodded, the gravity of their plans sinking in. "Thank you, Carl. I don't know what I'd do without you." "We're in this together," Carl replied firmly. "Now, let's go over the plan one more time." They rehearsed every detail, from the moment Mary would wake Gary to their escape route. Carl's calm demeanor was a balm to Mary's frayed nerves. As they parted ways, she felt a renewed sense of determination. Back at the Smith house, Mary moved through the motions of her evening routine, her mind racing. She waited until the house was silent, then quietly packed a few of Gary's belongings into the duffel bag. She double-checked the hidden camera, ensuring it captured the living room and entryway. Mary returned to the Smith house after her meeting with Carl, her mind swirling with the weight of their plan. The night was deepening, the house quiet. She slipped through the front door, careful not to make a sound, and headed towards Gary's room. She needed to prepare him for what was coming. Gary was sitting on his bed, his eyes wide and anxious as she entered. He looked up, sensing the urgency in her demeanor. "Mary, what's going on? You've been acting strange all day." Mary sat beside him, taking a deep breath. "Gary, we need to talk. I've been working on a plan to get you out of here, to keep you safe from Robert and Evelyn." Gary's eyes widened further, a mix of fear and hope flashing across his face. "What do you mean? How are we going to do that?" "I've been in touch with an old friend, Carl. He's going to help us. We're leaving tonight under the cover of darkness. It's risky, but it's our best chance." Gary's hands trembled, and he looked down at them, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Mary. What if something goes wrong? What if they catch us?" Mary reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know it's scary, but we can't stay here any longer. The longer we stay, the more danger you're in. We have to take this chance." Gary looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Why are you doing this for me? You're risking so much." Mary's heart ached at his words, the depth of his pain and confusion evident. "Because you deserve better, Gary. No one should have to live in fear like you have. I can't stand by and do nothing. We're going to get through this together." Gary's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, a new resolve hardening in his expression. "Okay, Mary. I trust you. I want to get out of here. I don't want to be afraid anymore." Mary squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "Good." The Smith house was enveloped in a tense silence, the kind that only comes in the dead of night. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she tiptoed down the hallway, her footsteps almost inaudible on the plush carpet. She paused outside Gary's room, took a deep breath, and gently pushed the door open. Gary was curled up on his bed, his sleep restless. Mary crept to his side, whispering softly, "Gary, wake up. It's time." Gary's eyes fluttered open, confusion quickly replaced by understanding. He sat up, his movements careful and silent. Mary handed him a small vial. "Drink this. It'll help you stay calm." Gary hesitated for a moment, then nodded and swallowed the liquid. His trust in Mary was complete, and she could see the fear mingled with hope in his eyes. Minutes later, Mary guided Gary out of his room. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon casting eerie shadows. They moved slowly, every creak of the floorboards making Mary's heart jump. They reached the back door, and Mary peeked outside. Carl was there, waiting by the truck, his figure barely visible in the dim light. "Come on, Gary," Mary whispered, leading him out into the cool night air. Carl hurried over, helping Gary into the back seat. The boy's eyes were wide, but he remained silent, his trust evident. "We need to move fast," Carl said in a low voice. "We don't know how much time we have." Mary nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. Carl started the engine, the truck rumbling to life. As they pulled away from the Smith house, Mary glanced back one last time. The imposing silhouette of the mansion was a stark contrast to the freedom they were seeking. Carl drove through the quiet streets with a steady hand, the tension in the truck palpable. Gary sat huddled in the back seat, his body tense but his eyes alert. "Are you okay, Gary?" Mary asked, turning to check on him. Gary nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm okay. Just scared." "I know," Mary replied, her tone firm but gentle. "But we're going to keep you safe. Carl and we won't let anything happen to you." The miles slipped by in a blur of darkened buildings and empty roads. Carl navigated with practiced ease, his focus unwavering. Mary kept a watchful eye on Gary, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. After what felt like hours, Carl pulled off the main road, taking a series of winding turns that led them into the countryside. The city lights faded, replaced by the quiet, comforting darkness of the rural landscape. "We're almost there," Carl said, breaking the silence. "A friend of mine has a place we can stay for a few days. It's safe, secluded." Mary felt a wave of relief. The first step of their plan had gone smoothly, but she knew this was just the beginning. The truck bounced along the dirt road, headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Mary, Gary, and Carl were silent, each lost in their thoughts. The weight of the night's events hung heavy in the air. Finally, they reached the small cabin, hidden away in the dense woods. Carl parked the truck and turned off the engine. "We're here," he said, breaking the silence. "This place should be safe for now." Mary turned to Gary, who was beginning to stir. "Gary, we made it. You're safe now." Gary blinked, slowly coming to. His eyes widened as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where are we?" "A friend's cabin," Carl explained, stepping out of the truck. "It's secluded. We'll be okay here." Mary helped Gary out of the truck, supporting him as they walked towards the cabin. Gary's steps were unsteady, but his grip on Mary's arm was strong. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, a stark contrast to the cold opulence of the Smith mansion. Carl set about making a fire, the crackling logs providing warmth and a sense of normalcy. "There's some food in the kitchen. Help yourselves," he said, his voice steady. Gary sank into an armchair, exhaustion etched on his face. Mary knelt beside him, gently brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Gary admitted, "but safe." "Thank you, Mary." Mary gave him a small smile. "You're welcome. We'll get through this together." Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. Mary made sure Gary ate and rested, watching over him with a careful eye. The bruises and cuts from Robert's abuse were stark against Gary's pale skin, a constant reminder of the horrors they'd escaped. Carl checked in regularly, bringing supplies and updates. "I've talked to a few people," he said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table. "We have some options for getting you both further away, maybe even new identities. But it'll take time." Mary nodded, her gaze shifting to Gary, who was dozing on the couch. "We'll do whatever it takes. I just want him to be safe." "He will be," Carl assured her. "We'll figure it out." The cabin's isolation gave them the space they needed to heal. Gary, once wary and withdrawn, began to open up. He and Mary spent hours talking, sharing stories, and slowly building a bond forged in shared adversity. "Mary," Gary said one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "why did you help me? You didn't have to." Mary looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Because you deserved better, Gary. No one should have to go through what you did. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." Gary's eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Mary replied softly. "Just focus on getting better. We have a long road ahead, but we'll face it together." As the days turned into weeks, Gary's physical wounds began to heal. The psychological scars would take longer, but Mary was patient. She knew that trust, once broken, was not easily mended. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Gary turned to Mary. "I've been thinking about the future. What happens next?" Mary took a deep breath. "We'll find a way to keep you safe. Carl is working on getting us new identities. It'll mean leaving everything behind, but we'll have a fresh start." Gary nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I'm ready. I just want to be free." "You will be," Mary promised. "We'll build a new life, one where you don't have to be afraid." Carl returned with good news a few days later. "I've got a lead on a safe place for you both. It's a long way from here, but it's secure. We'll leave at first light." Mary and Gary packed what little they had. The journey ahead was daunting, but hope had taken root. As they drove away from the cabin the next morning, Gary looked out the window, a sense of peace washing over him. He wasn't alone. Mary's presence was a constant comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. For Mary, the road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: she had found a purpose. Protecting Gary had become her mission, and she would see it through no matter the cost. The sun rose gently over the hills, casting a warm glow over the secluded cabin. Mary stood on the porch, sipping her coffee and taking in the serene landscape. It had been weeks since they arrived at their new sanctuary, a small house nestled deep in the countryside. The silence was a welcome change from the chaos they had fled. Gary emerged from the cabin, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning, Mary," he greeted, his voice still groggy. "Morning, Gary. Sleep well?" He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I did. It's nice here." Mary returned the smile. "It is. We're lucky to have this place." Their days settled into a quiet routine. Mary and Gary spent mornings tending to the small garden behind the cabin, afternoons exploring the woods, and evenings sharing simple meals. The tranquility of their surroundings was a balm for their weary souls. One afternoon, as they walked along a winding path through the forest, Gary paused, taking a deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented air. "It's so peaceful here," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Mary nodded. "It is. We needed this, a chance to heal." Gary glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever have to go back?" Mary shook her head firmly. "No, we're building a new life here. We won't look back." They continued their walk, the canopy of trees providing a cool shade. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves indicated the presence of small animals. The simplicity of their surroundings allowed them to focus on what truly mattered: each other. As days turned into weeks, Gary's transformation was evident. The haunted look in his eyes faded, replaced by a growing sense of peace. He laughed more, his smiles coming more easily. The physical scars were healing, but more importantly, the emotional wounds were beginning to mend. Mary watched these changes with a mixture of relief and pride. Gary's resilience was remarkable, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for being part of his journey. They often sat together on the porch in the evenings, sharing stories and dreams for the future. "Do you ever think about what you want to do when you're older?" Mary asked one night, the sky above them a blanket of stars. Gary considered the question. "Sometimes. I think I'd like to help people, maybe become a counselor or something. Like you helped me. Mary's heart swelled with emotion. You'd be great at that, Gary. You have a lot of empathy. Gary smiled, the expression genuine. Thanks, Mary. You've taught me a lot. Their bond deepened with each passing day. They were no longer just survivor and protector. They were family. The hardships they had faced together had forged an unbreakable connection, one built on trust, respect, and unconditional support. Carl visited regularly, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. His presence was a reassuring constant, a reminder that they were not alone. He had become an integral part of their new life, his steady demeanor and quiet strength providing a sense of security. One evening, as they sat around a small fire, Carl turned to Mary. "You've done a remarkable job, Mary. Gary's come a long way." Mary glanced at Gary, who was roasting marshmallows, his face illuminated by the firelight. "He's a remarkable kid," she replied. "I'm just glad I could help." Gary looked up, catching their conversation. "You've both helped me more than I can ever repay," he said earnestly. "I wouldn't be here without you." The fire crackled, and the three of them sat in comfortable silence, the bond they shared evident in every unspoken word. They had found something precious in their little haven, peace, healing, and a sense of belonging. As the days grew longer and the warmth of summer enveloped the countryside, Mary and Gary embraced their new life with open hearts. They tended to their garden, took long walks, and enjoyed the simple pleasures that their sanctuary offered. One day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Gary turned to Mary. "I feel happy here, Mary. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I belong." Mary smiled, her eyes misty with emotion. "You do belong, Gary. We both do." In the quiet of their new life, they discovered strength, hope, and a profound connection that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Together, they faced each day with renewed courage, ready to build a life filled with love, trust, and the simple joy of being together. The peace that had enveloped Mary and Gary's lives shattered one morning with the arrival of Carl, his face grim as he stepped into the cabin. The sun was just rising, casting a soft glow over the secluded hideaway, but the tension in Carl's demeanor dispelled any tranquility. "Mary, we need to talk," Carl said, his voice low. Mary glanced at Gary, who was preparing breakfast. She nodded and followed Carl outside, her heart pounding. "What's going on?" Carl took a deep breath. "I got word from a reliable source. The Smiths have found out where you are. They're coming for Gary." Mary felt the ground shift beneath her. "How? We've been so careful." "I don't know, but we need to act fast. They could be here any time." Panic surged through Mary, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We need a plan. We can't let them take him." Carl nodded. "We'll have to move again, but we need to be strategic about it. We can't afford any mistakes." Mary's mind raced. "What about tonight? We leave under cover of darkness." Carl agreed. "It's risky, but it's our best shot. I'll start packing the essentials." Inside the cabin, Gary looked up as Mary and Carl entered. "What's happening?" Mary took his hand, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Gary, we have to leave. The Smiths know where we are." Fear flashed in Gary's eyes. "But I thought we were safe here." "We were, but things have changed. We'll keep you safe, I promise." Gary nodded, his trust in Mary unwavering. "What do I need to do?" "Pack your things, just the essentials. We need to move quickly." As they prepared to leave, Mary felt a mix of fear and determination. They had built a life here, but it wasn't worth Gary's safety. By nightfall, they were ready. Carl had scouted a new location, another remote hideaway further into the wilderness. "We'll take the back roads," Carl said as they loaded the truck. "Less chance of being spotted." The journey was tense, each mile fraught with anxiety. Gary sat in the back, clutching a small bag of belongings, his eyes reflecting the strain of their constant vigilance. Mary kept her gaze on the road ahead, her mind focused on the plan. Hours passed in silence until Carl finally spoke. "We're almost there. Just a little further." Relief was short-lived. As they approached a narrow pass, headlights appeared behind them, closing in fast. Mary's heart raced. "Carl, they're following us." Carl's grip tightened on the wheel. "Hold on!" The truck swerved, taking sharp turns as Carl tried to lose their pursuers. Gary clung to his seat, his face pale with fear. Mary turned to him, her voice firm. "Gary, stay down. We'll get through this." The chase seemed endless, but Carl's determination paid off. He found a narrow path leading into a dense forest and took it, the headlights fading behind them. They drove deeper until they were sure they had lost the Smiths. "We can't stay here," Carl said, his breath heavy, "but we bought some time." They pressed on, finally reaching the new hideout just before dawn. It was a small, abandoned cabin hidden away in a thicket of trees. Exhausted, they unloaded the truck and settled in. Gary sat on the edge of a worn-out bed, his hands shaking. "Mary, what if they find us again?" Mary knelt beside him, her voice steady. "We'll be ready. We won't let them take you." Carl joined them, his face resolute. "We'll stay alert. We've come this far and we won't give up now." The next few days were a blur of preparation and vigilance. Carl set up makeshift alarms around the perimeter while Mary kept a close eye on Gary, ensuring he felt safe and supported. One evening as they sat together, Gary looked at Mary with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm scared, Mary, but I trust you. I know you'll protect me." Mary's heart ached, but she nodded. "I will, Gary. We're in this together." The bond between them had grown stronger, forged by adversity and the unwavering commitment to each other's safety. They knew the road ahead was fraught with danger, but their resolve was unbreakable. The Smiths had underestimated them, but they would soon learn just how far she and Carl were willing to go to protect Gary. Together, they would face whatever came next, ready to fight for the peace and safety they so desperately sought. The night was heavy with tension. Mary and Gary huddled in the small cabin, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Carl had gone to get supplies, but he had been gone too long. Mary's worry grew with each passing minute. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was Carl's number. Relief washed over her as she answered. "Carl, where are you?" A cold, familiar voice answered instead. "Hello, Mary?" Her blood ran cold. "Robert?" "Yes, it's me. And I have your friend here. He's quite cooperative." Mary's heart pounded. "What do you want?" "I want my son back. Bring Gary to the old barn on Route 22 by midnight, or your friend suffers the consequences." Mary's hands shook as she ended the call. She turned to Gary, who had been listening intently. "They have Carl." Gary's face paled. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to get Carl back, but we need to be smart about it." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We have to face them." Gary nodded, his eyes wide but resolute. "I'm ready." They gathered what little they had. Mary stuffed a flashlight, rope, and a small knife into a bag. She knew they were walking into a trap, but there was no other choice. They couldn't leave Carl behind. The drive to the barn was tense. Mary's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Gary sat silently beside her, his determination a mirror of her own. They arrived at the barn just before midnight. The place was eerily quiet, the full moon casting long shadows. Mary parked the car a short distance away, and they approached cautiously. "Stay close," she whispered to Gary. As they neared the barn, the door creaked open, revealing Robert and two of his men, holding Carl between them. His face was bruised, but his eyes were clear and defiant. "Mary," Robert greeted, a smug smile on his face. "I see you brought Gary. Good. This will be quick." Mary stepped forward, her voice steady. "Let Carl go." Robert laughed. "You're not in a position to make demands. Hand over Gary, and maybe I'll let your friend live." Mary's mind raced. She needed to buy time. "Gary, go to him," she said softly. Gary stepped forward, his fear palpable but his steps steady. Robert's men pushed Carl aside, grabbing Gary roughly. "Good boy," Robert sneered. "Now, Mary, say goodbye." Mary's heart pounded. She had to act. As Robert turned to leave, she lunged, pulling the knife from her bag. "Let him go!" Chaos erupted. Carl, despite his injuries, tackled one of the men, while Mary fought off the other. Gary struggled against Robert's grip, his desperation giving him strength. Mary managed to free Gary, shoving him toward Carl. "Run!" Gary hesitated, but Carl grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the car. "Go, Gary! Mary and I will handle this." Robert lunged at Mary, but she dodged, her knife flashing in the moonlight. "You're not taking him, Robert," Robert sneered. "You think you can stop me?" Mary's resolve hardened. Yes. She fought with a fierceness she didn't know she possessed, determined to protect Gary and save Carl. Suddenly, the piercing wail of police sirens. The sound grew louder, and within moments, flashing blue and red lights filled the area around the barn. Mary's heart leaped. She had almost forgotten in the chaos, but before they left, she had managed to send a quick message to the police with their location. "What's going on?" Gary asked, his voice trembling. Mary gripped his shoulder. "I called the police before we left. Help is here." Robert's men were still recovering from the scuffle, but their expressions turned from smug confidence to shock as police cars surrounded them. Officers quickly exited their vehicles, weapons drawn, and shouted commands. "Everyone on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" Robert tried to run, but an officer tackled him to the ground, swiftly cuffing him. His face twisted with rage and frustration. "This isn't over, Mary!" he spat, his voice filled with venom. Mary stood tall, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. "Yes, it is, Robert." The police moved efficiently, securing the area and apprehending Robert's men. The barn, once a place of terror, was now under the control of law enforcement. One of the officers approached Mary, Carl, and Gary. "Are you all right?" Carl, now visibly struggling to stay conscious, shook his head weakly. "He's badly hurt," Mary said urgently. "He needs medical attention." The officer nodded and signaled to the paramedics who had arrived on the scene. They rushed to Carl, assessing his injuries with practiced precision. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," one of them said. As they loaded Carl onto a stretcher, he managed to grab Mary's hand. "Take care of Gary," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're going to be fine, Carl," Mary assured him, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We'll see you at the hospital." The paramedics quickly transported Carl to the waiting ambulance. Mary and Gary followed, their worry evident. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity. At the hospital, Carl was rushed into surgery. Mary and Gary were left in the waiting room, the sterile environment doing little to calm their nerves. Mary paced the floor, her mind racing with thoughts of what could happen. Gary sat quietly, his hands clenched in his lap. "Do you think he'll be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary stopped pacing and sat beside him, taking his hand. "He's strong, Gary. He'll pull through. We just have to believe that." Hours passed in agonizing silence until finally a doctor approached them. "He's stable," the doctor said, his voice reassuring. "The injuries were severe, but he's going to make it." Relief washed over Mary, her knees nearly giving way. "Can we see him?" "Of course. He's asking for you." Mary and Gary followed the doctor to Carl's room. Seeing him lying there, pale but alive, brought tears to Mary's eyes. Gary hesitated at the door, then rushed to Carl's side. "Carl," Gary said, his voice trembling. "You're okay." Carl smiled weakly. "Hey, kid. Took you long enough to get here." Mary moved to Carl's other side, her relief palpable. "You scared us," she said, her voice steadying. "But you're going to be fine." The days that followed were a blur of recovery and adjustment. Carl's strength returned slowly but surely, aided by the unwavering support of Mary and Gary. The hospital became a place of healing and reflection, a temporary sanctuary as they planned their next steps. Robert and his men were charged and taken into custody, their influence and power finally broken. The shadow that had loomed over Mary and Gary's lives was lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and justice. One evening, as Carl rested, Mary and Gary sat in the hospital garden, the setting sun casting a warm glow over them. "We did it," Mary said softly. "We're free." Gary nodded, his eyes bright with hope. "Thanks to you and Carl. I don't know how to repay you." Mary smiled, her hand resting on Gary's shoulder. "You don't need to repay us. We're family now. We take care of each other." Carl joined them a few days later, his strength slowly returning. Together they left the hospital, ready to start a new chapter in their lives. The past still haunted them, but the future was bright with promise. Together, they faced the future with hope and courage, ready to embrace whatever came next. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. In their little sanctuary, they found peace, love, and the strength to move forward, one step at a time. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this story unfold. I hope you found it as touching and emotional as I did while writing it. You know, I firmly believe that God always blesses those who do good. Remember, happiness will come to those who persist and stay true to their values. Story reminds us all to keep faith, to keep doing good, and to trust that even in our darkest times, there is a light guiding us toward a brighter future. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming heartwarming and inspiring stories. Your support means the world to me and helps me continue creating content that we can all connect with. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay blessed, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next video.